Now we're going to jump into some other things. We're going to look at the third part of CCSSO's mission, as you saw, or our math mission, as you saw Carissa put on the slides earlier, and that's aligning supplemental and intervention materials or learning experiences to the core instruction. So high quality instructional materials, core instruction, but what do we do beyond that? And there's three of them alluded to that, and as Secretary Oliva just reminded us, we need to teach everyone on grade level, but some of our students are not there, and so what do we do to supplement that? I want to point out some things that they said as the rest of I'm going to first invite one of that's Utah Superintendent, my good friend Sid Dickson, to come up. So the Superintendent of Public Instruction in Utah is going to join me, and also Rosalyn Rice-Harris, who's the Senior Director of Collaboratives at CCSSO. And I'm going to ask them to go ahead and take a seat while I introduce our panel. I'm going to get to join them to talk about this wonderful work that's going on too. But we just heard some things, some reminders from what we heard from the Arkansas team. So Secretary Oliva said, we cannot, I think he's the one who said it, I made so many notes. We can't remediate ourselves out of the bottom. Maybe one of these ladies said that. We can't remediate ourselves out of the bottom. And I also heard this, the more you scale up, the more there is to do. What great advice. And then I love what Jacob said, the experts are already in your classroom. Take advantage of, what did they say, 3,500 teachers who were involved in writing new standards. So lots of good advice that comes from Arkansas. And now again, as we talk about action item 3 from the report, I have these ladies here on stage to lead us. We are doing some great work in Alabama and are very proud of our Numeracy Act, and the implementation of that has been mentioned. But also, we realize that what goes on outside the classroom is almost as important as what goes in the classroom. And so because of that, we've talked about supplemental learning opportunities and even established a new office called the OXL, or Office of Extended Learning, at our department to help coordinate the funding and to align opportunities beyond the school day to dig more deeply into mathematics and also literacy and other things that we are focusing on. And then Superintendent Dickson has so many great things that go on in Arkansas, my state. I don't know, you're working in Arkansas too? In Utah. And she and I compare notes often, because even though she's a western state, we're a southern state, our populations are so similar in both size and demographic, and a lot of the issues we deal with are the same issues. So I'm so glad to have her on stage with us today. And Rosalyn, I think you're going to take the lead here, and I'm going to join you too as a seat.
Ooh. Okay, thanks so much. Thank you all so much. And as a former math teacher, just very excited to hear this conversation about how math is progressing across the country. So Superintendent Mackey, Superintendent Dickson, you're both doing wonderful work around supplemental instruction, intervention, and making sure that these systems of support are weaved in and directly aligned to the core instruction that's being provided in districts. So you're supporting and providing guidance in a variety of ways, and we're going to take some time together today to learn about what are these innovative ways you're doing this work, how you're best supporting districts, and providing some lessons learned for everyone watching here in the room, as well as online. So I'd love to get into the first question. So again, you all have amazing and comprehensive approaches to improving student outcomes in math. And I'd like each of you to paint a picture for us about your approaches that you're taking at your SEAs to improve math outcomes in your state. So Superintendent Dickson, I'll start with you. Tell us more about your approach, and what are you hoping the impacts to be?
Thank you, Rosalyn. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, my friends in this room. You know, when the first NAEP scores came out after the pandemic, people were saying, why are you the only state that stayed flat in 8th grade math? What did you do? Like there was some big secretive thing. And I really had to stop and reflect because I wasn't sure of that answer. I knew all the things that we were doing, but I wasn't really clear about why we stood out. And it took me back to this very visceral opportunity that I had when the Common Core came out. You might have heard of that. You know, mathematics was a big deal for us, and we started looking at our remediation rates going into college, and they were high. A lot of kids needing remediation and other transition times, and really started to focus on those 8 mathematical practices. In working with our teachers, where we put a lot of our money, time, and focus, we had to say, what do we believe about our kiddos first and foremost? And we believe that all students have the ability to make sense of mathematics. But some need more resources, to your point, Rosalyn. They need more resources, they need more time, they need more support. So when we started drilling down to that, we realized our teachers needed that same thing. And we had a lot of imposters among our teaching ranks. I was one of those. I was a 6th grade teacher, and I remember trying to just keep up with my kids. You know, I loved teaching math. I loved math as a student. I'm a child of the 70s, a teenager of the 70s. My school counselor told me that because I was a girl, that I did not need to take upper mathematics and put me into secretarial courses. I showed that counselor. I became a school counselor and made sure that every kiddo had opportunities, but also wanting to make sure that that we thought about the teaching workforce above all. So we really put our emphasis there, and I didn't want anybody to feel like I did when I was teaching and just trying to keep up understanding the mathematics and having to do a lot of study the night before I taught a lesson. I wanted our teachers to be confident. So that's my personal story that I'm confessing to you that has driven a lot of this work. So reflecting again on a time where we were rolling out our new standards based on those 8 mathematical practices of the Common Core. And we were taking an integrated approach, and it was so different for our teachers. And they put on a smile, and they were showing up, but I could see the angst. And there was a lot of resistance and pushback and anger. And so we were in this beautiful setting. If you've been to our national parks, a delicate arch. It's very famous with Utah when you see anything depicted with Utah. And I decided I was going to hike the crank out of these teachers that were so mad at me. So we did a midnight hike to Delicate Arch. And on the pathway to this beautiful place in a starry night, we had confessional time, and so many of these teachers just said, I don't know the math. I'm not a competent teacher. I need help understanding mathematics. And a lot of these teachers were teachers of students with disabilities. So honestly, we've focused on, first and foremost, on professional learning for our teachers, including coaching. And we embedded professional learning standards into code. So I was so impressed when Lindsay was showing all of the policy levers, and we were orange, you know, we were not a purple state. But I thought, wow, we're really doing all of these things without the policy. And that's in large part, Lindsay was our secondary math specialist to help make it happen. So does policy matter? Yes. But when you invest in your teacher workforce, as we've just heard from the great state of Arkansas, it makes all the difference. And we believe that high quality professional learning is fundamental to everything. So we've put those standards in code and make sure that it's not just a one-shot wonder, which is committee malpractice, that they need coaching and follow-up and support. And I'll get into what we do with interventions with kiddos later. But that, for us, has been fundamental to everything. High-quality professional learning, that includes coaching.
Superintendent Dickson, thank you so much. I really love that remark you made about being able to integrate the professional learning standards. So to ensure that our teachers don't feel like imposters, we want to make sure they feel prepared each and every day. And we do that through high quality materials and professional development. So thank you for sharing. Superintendent Mackey, again, thank you for everything you're doing in mathematics, and we'd love to learn more about your comprehensive approach to mathematics, as well as what does supplementing and intervening for students, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, I'd love to have a minute on that question. But first I have to thank my colleague for being a great school counselor and counseling everybody that they can do. And what a great model. I didn't know you were a school counselor. See, I've learned something today on stage.
Did you know that you're supposed to wear pink on Wednesdays?
Did not, but
just saying.
I promise, I tell you, if you ever see me up here in a pink suit, you take a picture.
You're the man.
So, okay. Now, where was I? So, you know, as as Superintendent Dickson was saying, it's pretty interesting. I've thought about this several times. Like if teachers are the key, and Secretary Oliva already said that, teachers are the key, and we know that. But as a principal, most of us in the room probably spent some time as a principal. If you interviewed an elementary teacher and they said during the interview, I'm not really a math person, probably wouldn't actually chink them much on the interview. If they came in and said, you know, I can't read, that probably would be an issue for us thinking about teaching, letting them teach children. And so we do have to empower teachers. And I don't mean that. If a teacher comes in and they don't feel comfortable, like they know the material, then that's up to us. That's our responsibility to make sure they do know the material. So we're kind of attacking it on two sides. One of them is with teachers, so building up our teachers' skills. Now, the key component of our Numeracy Act, and I know many other states are doing the same thing, but it's about hiring and training highly efficient math coaches. So our law will, when it is fully implemented, and it's a 6-year implementation, we'll have 800 math coaches, a little over 800, one in every school that has any configuration of grades K through 5. And so that'll cost us about $100 million a year. And that we have about 600 now. So that's really expensive, but this is the more difficult piece, because when our legislature did that, they actually said, you know what, this was, we had money, we'll give you the money, just go hire all of them this year. And I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. Like, there is no possible way we can actually identify and train that many people in one time. We have to do this slowly if we're going to do it right. So it's about training our teachers up, and the main way we're doing that is through coaching and making sure they do know, use that term again, I laughed, unpacking the standards. So they know what the standards mean, they know how they align, they know how to teach them, they know how to assess them in the classroom. And that's not easy for teachers, and we have really focused, all of us have focused so much on literacy that now when we come back and ask teachers, you have to still go 100 miles an hour with everything you've been doing in literacy, but by the way, we're adding another 100 mile an hour to math. And that's a lot to put on our teachers, especially early childhood and elementary teachers. So we're trying to support them in multiple ways. Now, the second part of that is higher ed. So we are digging in intensely into higher ed educator prep, so that when teachers come out, the next generation of teachers, and that's going to take, that's going to be 6 years from now, but we're going to try to have better elementary teachers coming into the classroom that learn in higher ed how to unpack those standards. And what we learned was, we had, like most of you, and it was 6 or 9 hours of math that every teacher had to take, college math. But that college math did not in any way have to align to anything they would ever teach or see in their assignment, say in an elementary school. And so we've come back and said, we're, in addition to whatever the college says you have to take, college algebra and so forth, like we want methods courses in how to teach elementary math. And we're requiring that now, and we are building a new assessment to align to that, so that we're going to assess our teachers before they're certified in do they understand the math they'll be teaching, and can they teach it to students. And then the third piece I want to mention quickly is what we're doing outside the classroom. As I said just a minute ago, we have seen that what we're doing outside the classroom is almost as important as what's going inside the classroom. I think we all learned during COVID that parents who had means, even when we were all in chaos, they went out and they hired really good tutors for their students, and what we see in the NAEP results is their students didn't get behind, and in many cases they actually accelerated, largely because of these extra resources. But then for the parents who cannot afford that, or who do not know how important that is, or who do not have the opportunity to drive their kids to tutoring, then we all have the responsibility to provide those extra resources. So that's why we started OXL, to coordinate after school, before school, intersession, and summer programming, to make sure that we have high quality, that we're trying to figure out how to measure that quality. We're still learning this as we go. I have a great team over here that could speak better to this than I can. But really, so we have all these programs going on. Some of them we run, not the department, some of them our districts run. Some of them are run by Boys and Girls Clubs. They're run by other community partners. But there really is no common measure of which ones are high quality and which ones are not. And they all tell us that they're really high quality, but we're trying to dig in deeper. If we're going to support you and we're going to fund you, then we've got to know more about what outcomes you're getting. And of course, there's more to that too. So we want students also to have fun. We have these big summer reading and math camps, and they're intensely focused on teaching reading and math, but we also don't want it to feel like 2 more months of school. We want it to feel like you're going to camp. And that's very hard to do. How do you make it a more relaxed setting and yet also rigorous and focused on teaching the standards?
Superintendent Mackey, thank you so much. Both of you all shared really key insights about the work you're doing with your teachers in order to better understand the curricula, being able to provide supports, and helping them make connections. We'd love for you to talk more about your support of making the connection of what's going on in classrooms to what's going on outside of classrooms. If it's summer learning or co-curricular activities or before or after school programs, what does that intervention piece look like? So Superintendent Mackey, I'll start with you. If you can tell us more about your new Office of Expanded Learning Time and how much you're ensuring each part of your approach is connected and building on core instruction.
So core instruction is number one. We have to have tier 1 instruction, has to be high quality instructional materials. We've heard that, we've said that, we believe it, and we're all trying to get there. The next step, what do we do for those students who are still struggling? And in mathematics, we know from the results, both our state test and the NAEP, that a lot of students are struggling. We're not talking about a very small percentage of students. We're talking about a lot of students that need tier 2 and even tier 3 instruction. Again, we're trying to reach outside the classroom with that, so that's one strategy, is how do we get students into these other programs. So we, in math, we have summer math camps, I mentioned that, and we intently focus on students who test below grade level in math. And they're not the only ones who are invited, but they're the ones we strongly encourage to come to our summer camps. If we do reading and math, if a student is in both reading and math camp, it's pretty much a full day for 4 weeks in the summer. We'll let the districts do some picking and choosing on when those weeks are, and how they want to offer the instruction and how they staff it, hire teachers and aides and custodians and all that. But we do pay for that. And this is an interesting thing. So we paid for it with federal funds for a couple of years. So our legislature actually wrote these summer camps into the law, into both our literacy and numeracy bills. But then we were able to fund that with federal money. So I was sweating bullets when it came time to tell the legislature, like, you have to, now there is no more federal money, this is in the law, you have to pay for it. So there's a little trick in there. Get them to pass it with no cost and then add the cost in. But they did. So they fully funded it for this summer. Will be fully funded with state funds, including transportation. There's a lot to that. You talk to local superintendents, they will tell you it is not fully funded. And I understand that, because they have to run a bus route to pick up one kid who lives 20 miles from the school, and we give them an average. And so we understand that there are additional costs, so we try to help our rural districts kind of work through that. But we're paying for teachers, we're paying for aides, we're paying for custodians, and we are paying for transportation. Now, here's the last piece with this, and I'll pass it to my colleague over there in the pink suit who knows better. But this is amazing, amazing data. We found that if we bring a kindergartner in who is behind, and it's already been said, it's hard to assess kindergartners, but if they're behind in kindergarten, we bring them in for 4 weeks of summer school, their growth rate is twice what we get out of a third grader. And we just do it K through 3, but we actually in math we do K through 5. My suspicion is we would see that line keep going down in 7th and 8th grade, because it's the earlier we get them, the better. Earlier better, earlier better, earlier better. So we're really focusing on early childhood and how quickly can we identify students who are behind. We're doing a lot of screeners. Somebody else has already mentioned screeners today. And then how do we immediately intervene with these extra programs so that we get those students caught up as quickly as possible.
Superintendent Mackey, thank you so much. I appreciate that focus on early learning. The gap is much smaller and their curiosity is much larger, so it's so much easier to close. So thank you for making that a focus.
By the time they're in 7th grade, if you tell them they have to go to the school building during the summer, they realize it ain't camp.
So, Superintendent Dickson, I'd like to turn to you, and we'd love to hear more about your integrated approach to mathematics and professional learning for your educators, and coupling that with the use of technology, which I know that you've been working on in Utah for a while. So we'd love to learn more about that.
Yeah, thank you, Rosalyn. So when we looked at those mathematical practices that came out, it just made sense to us that kids learn and use math in very integrated ways. So we took an integrated approach to our standards, something that we adopted as a state. And we've talked about standards already here today ad nauseum. But I will say that we have a 12-step, I'm never really sure how many steps, they keep getting subtracted and added. But I call it the 12-step program for standards adoption. And our board spends about 2 years from start to finish adopting standards because we want a lot of community input, teacher input, parent input, and it goes back and forth. It's quite an iterative process. We're right now doing that again because of the things that Jacob and others talked about earlier of parents and others just not quite understanding. However, that integrated approach meant that we had to spend a lot of time writing some of our own curriculum. Materials just weren't out there. We saw, not to disparage our good publishing friends, but we were all in it together. Nobody really knew how to approach the standards in a mass production way. So we ended up spending a lot of time and energy with teachers coming together to write the materials. And, you know, I think it's I'll end where we started. Of you see the goalpost. You want all kids to be mathematically literate, and wouldn't it be a bonus if they all love mathematics? Sometimes we don't help our educators take the first 10 yards. You know, you can see the goal line. They get it. They get the big picture. But those first 10 yards are difficult. So we took on the responsibility as an SEA to not only develop materials, but to really put a lot of interventions forward. So if you go on our website, you will see a lot in the space of math interventions. And we base it all on a multi-tiered system of support. Everybody's familiar with MTSS. And so we didn't want to have this disparate thing called interventions over here, but really how does it fit into levels of instruction that we all know? So we really categorize interventions in that way. We don't do as much in summer learning, in a large part because of funding, but also in large part in Utah, kids like every other place, they're busy in the summer. So we do have a summer school, but not, I'm going to come to camp in Alabama. So we do a lot during the school day. We have built-in intervention time for our kiddos. We double block. We have developed courses around data science. Lindsay started this before she left, and we got out into our rural areas, and kids were really struggling in that Algebra 2 space. Now, we have clever names like Secondary 1, Math 7, Math 8, Secondary 1, 2, and 3. Because we start teaching kids algebraic sense-making when they're in kindergarten. We have screeners, just like we've talked about. We do all the things, but we really feel like math is not taught in disparate and discrete ways, that it's very integrated. So we start teaching these concepts to our young kiddos, K1, 2, 3, and build upon that. And the interventions go along with that. So double blocking, intervention, in-school time, doubling down on in-class interventions, and that's where technology comes in. We don't want technology to take over the primary instruction of mathematics, but we want it to be a support. And that's how we have used it and used it well. And then we do make sure that we screen our tools to make sure that they align with the standards, that they're high quality. Going along with high quality instructional materials, it's not just a bright, shiny piece of software, but it really has to align and deepen kiddos' understanding of mathematics. So we have been in the technology space for a very long time, and that's part of, I think, why we did well early on in the NAEP scores. Now, well means we stayed flat. Like, that's a weird bragging point, quite frankly. But just to say that we're the only ones that did that along with the DOD, I think it's because we had started a technology initiative, digital teaching and learning initiative, years before, so that when the pandemic came, nobody was prepared. Certainly we were not, but we were able to really flip on a dime and have 70% of our kids online. And that's where our math tools were very handy at that time. Otherwise, they were struggling to have all the kind of instruction that they would normally get in the classroom.
Thank you for sharing that. It's really exciting to hear how long you've been using technology to support the work that you're doing within schools across Utah, and how you're working hard to ensure that the technology, your core curricula, MTSS, is being elevated and used to support during the school day.
Yeah, I have to finish a sentence on the rural kiddos because I
Absolutely.
dropped off somewhere, as I tend to do, the older I get especially. One of the things that we found when we were looking in that Algebra 2 space for rural kiddos is that it's not that they couldn't understand, they just didn't see the relevance. And I think earlier today we heard how bringing different kinds of mathematics into play can help our kids. So we have medical math, we have data science, which has been amazing to see that in our urban and rural spaces, and continuing to build out different types of math that are more career-oriented, so that when they get through to that end of the row of how am I going to use this at the end of the day, we're really starting to reformat how we think about different tracks for different pathways for kiddos, and it's making a difference.
Speaking about relevance, we hear everyone say, many of our chiefs say that our districts are local control, so this is, it can be a suggestion. You all are taking the lead in supporting your districts in doing this really important work. So I'd like to talk more about the roles that states can play, the state leaders can play in moving this work, and what do you see your role as when supporting your districts? How do you support them in alignment to high-quality instructional materials, support them in developing their core instruction, support them in developing policy? We definitely would like to learn more about how you view your role and how do you exercise it as a result.
I'll go first, and I'll go kind of quick. I know we're running out of time. Great conversation. But I think we have to remember all teachers want their students to excel. I mean, there are no teachers that don't want their students to be good at math, good at reading. So the gap is sometimes in that knowledge base. And I think it's the same with local boards, superintendents, principals. Look, everybody wants the A+. Everybody wants their students to do really well. So we have to make it less, when you think about the carrot stick thing, we focus really heavily on the carrots and fertilizing the soil. So we want to offer them the carrots, but we also want to offer them an opportunity to have the resources to grow. And of course, we have accountability systems and all too, so that shows up. But I think the key is we got to see the locals as partners and use the leverage we have to tell them how best to do things, and to have the other piece too. So for instance, with high quality instructional materials, we do have a process, and we kind of sort of say you absolutely have to use something that's on our list. If they say they don't want to do that, then we get into a little tussle. But I would say that happens maybe 2% of the time. Most of the districts are thankful that we're giving them high quality instructional materials, paying for them, and helping them learn how to use them.
Thank you.
Yeah, ours is sort of a three-pronged approach. First of all, standards. You've got to have high-quality, performance-based standards and assessments that are aligned. The second is a lot of resources and support. That's for families, students, teachers, interventions, high-quality materials, all of the things. And then third, we believe in going out and providing high-quality professional learning in concert with our folks out in the LEAs. I loved your first comment, Rosalyn. We all love local control until we don't. And I think it's something that we learned in the Mississippi story with literacy. One of the things that Dr. Wright told us first and foremost was make sure that you have control over how your coaches are trained. Because everybody had coaches out in the field and everybody was doing coaching. And then you would go out and look at it and say, that's kind of telling. That's not really coaching. You're just telling somebody what to do without modeling it. So we have stepped into that space, especially with literacy, and we learned from that. So we're doing a lot more with having some jurisdiction over our mathematics coaches as well.
Well, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you both for sharing your insights as well as your lessons learned regarding providing supplemental supports and interventions, as well as how does this all tie together to improve math outcomes. So thank you both. Thank you, Superintendent Dickson. Thank you, Superintendent Mackey.
Thank you.
We'll now turn the spotlight on aligned research. We are intentionally featuring state voices to demonstrate examples of each state action and also hear from leading researchers about what they are learning and how it works when it comes to improving student outcomes in math. I am pleased to welcome Jean Kerns, Chief Academic Officer at Renaissance, who will help us understand the most critical skills for math learning progression. Jean?
Thank you. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. And thanks to everybody from CCSSO for this opportunity. I will say, as I take the stage, sometimes I wonder how I got there. And what I mean by that is one time I took the stage after Wintley Phipps, a Grammy-winning recording artist. I will not sing for you. Actually, the day after that, I took the stage after Nicholas Sparks, the year that he was named Time Magazine's most sexy author. I don't think I even need to explain. And here I stand the last few minutes before your break, an hour and 40 minutes in. Here's the two promises I'm going to try to make for you. In a very short period of time, I would like to share with you insights about how you can know, among the skills that you find when you unpack standards, the less than 30% that make the biggest difference, and within those most essential skills, the ones that will be the most disproportionately challenging ones for your teachers and your students. So, as we begin, what I would like to ask you to do is to consider, notice what I said here, the stated need for learning progressions. There's a difference between what gets stated and what we actually execute on and what we actually do. And what I mean by that is, take a look at the words of Margaret Heritage, who's worked with many of you over the years. Notice what she says. We have a plethora of standards. And despite the fact that we have them and have had them, that doesn't necessarily mean that our teachers actually understand how learning progresses. Now, to contextualize this, she's writing this within a larger paper on learning progressions. And the references to the values of learning progressions are out there. So we see it referenced in the current CCSSO report that refers back to the National Math Panel report from 2008 that's based on research that began in 2006. Y'all, we are breaths away from being 2 decades in to having received that recommendation. So you'll notice what I said was the stated need for these things. What I would ask you to consider is, did you listen to the recommendation and execute on it? Because those very words about a focused, coherent progression of skills within mathematics were what advisors offered to us nearly 20 years ago when we were looking to do a major upgrade to our math content. And I'll tell you, we leaned heavily into that recommendation and into that area, and I will say that it has been an incredibly fruitful one for us that has precipitated many learnings, 2 of which I'd like to share with you today. The first thing is this: we learned in this deep dive into the learning progression state, we learned the skills that truly matter the most. Now, we've repeated this work, so we've actually built and can give access to you for parts of this learning progressions for every single state represented. Any state that's revised your standards over the last 10 years, we wrote a new one for you. We've written one for territories in Canada. We've written one for the English national curriculum. We have written a sum total of more than 130 different learning progressions. And here's what's interesting about doing progression work. Everybody does standard unpacking. That's part of it. Take the standards, find the skills that are in there. But what that often results is a lot of unpacked standards where people focus intently on the grades that they serve. And then we steal time every now and then to do a little vertical articulation. When you're writing a standards-based learning progression, you do those two things equally. You spend just as much time looking at each individual grade as you do looking at how things build across the entire system. And I think it's by looking at that thing vertically that sometimes we get some insights that we would otherwise completely miss. What it also means is, when our teams that did not do this work alone, but we worked with folks like Margaret Heritage, like Amanda Vanderheyden, Karen Hess at the National Center for Assessment, as our teams were analyzing your state standards and building corresponding learning progressions associated with them, it seemed a natural thing for them to identify those skills that mattered the most. Because there was a reference earlier, that I didn't hit the citation on there, but what it said was, we need these learning progressions and we need to ask students, expect them to master certain things, and what I would add to that is, at certain points. There are certain things that successfully, for example, to finish third grade, you've got to learn there, because if you don't finish it in third grade, you will not be ready for what is asked of you in grade 4. And so on, and so on, and so on. And so as our teams were doing these deep dives into all these standards, one of the things that just simply naturally flowed from there was, well, let's identify those skills that matter the most. We refer to them as focus skills. We make them freely available as part of the app and the information that we provided for you. And here's a definition from the National Foundation of Educational Research, partners of ours on this work in London, where they say, these are the skills that are considered the essential underpinnings or foundations of future learning. In other words, for example, what must you learn in grade 1 to be ready for what's coming at you in grade 2? And what must you learn in grade 2 to be ready for you to be coming at grade 3? Do you see that difference then? We spend so little time on the vertical articulation that we miss out these opportunities. And because we don't spend just as much focus about across grade level kinds of things as we do on targeted grade level types of things, sometimes there's some insights that escape us. Let me give you a couple examples. I'll just show a few states here. Again, we have the information for all of them. Take the Florida math standards and pack them. The result is 1,135 discrete teachable skills that kids need to learn. 27% of them were identified as focus skills. In the case of Texas, it's 20% of the TEKS. In the case of New York State standards, it's 26% identified as focus skills. In the case of Colorado, it's 28%. You see some fairly consistent patterns, and it's not saying simply just teach these 28%, but what it is saying is these 28% in the case of Colorado, at these particular points are absolutely critical. So while they might represent 28% of the standards, don't spend 28% of the time on them, spend perhaps more. There's enough time for us to target the things that matter most and then cover many of the other skills. But at certain points along the way, there are things that just must be brought to closure. Said differently in the guidance document from CCSSO, we've got to know the progressions, and we've got to know how to bring kids to proficiency at certain points in certain things if we are to keep the system marching ahead as it should. So, I think of the focus skills as being the load-bearing walls and the foundations of a structure. If they're strong, things go well. If they're not strong, things don't necessarily go well. And this entire conversation about learning progressions is making sure that teachers know the things that mattered most. Because it's one thing to have a crack or a gap in a demising wall. It's quite another thing to have a crack or a gap in a foundation. And educators need to know the difference. Again, these references continuing here are saying we need this emphasis on vertical progression. And this afternoon, we've already heard multiple references to accelerated learning and working with kids on grade level. Well, y'all, that can't happen if a kid is off grade level and we don't understand the vertical gaps between where that kid is and where they're expected to be. These are the elements, these are the tools that bring these things together. let me share one other thing that we learned. So we identified those skills that absolutely matter the most. We can make them, if you just follow the resources in the app, you can see them for any state. The second one requires just a little bit of context. And that is, as we were building our learning progressions, we applied a empirical validation process to it. Here's what I mean by that. Here's a statistical line of best fit that shows the relationship between the skills that our research experts hypothesized was the right order to teach things to kids, and the actual difficulty that kids experienced when those skills were placed in front of them. So across the bottom, you see a hypothesized order of a learning progression of skills. Up the side, you see, well, what happened when kids actually took items related to those skills? Each dot represents a skill in that pattern there. So for example, that one that's circled up there, it's an outlier. That occurs at the third grade level, and it is the single hardest third grade skill that it is. In fact, in terms of relative difficulty, it's more than 2 grade levels harder than any other skill surrounding it. This process was identified, and we did it primarily when we built our reading learning progression, because some people thought reading learning progressions might not be that executable because reading is so many intertwined skills, but we did find this relationship in there. Every skill that was an outlier was gone back and double-checked to make sure it was in the right place, but here's what we learned. There are simply some realities of learning that we must deal with. And one of the realities is that there are certain skills that are just disproportionately difficult. Said differently, if learning is a staircase, not every step is of equal height. You begin with fractions, and you have a kid saying 1/3 plus 1/3, 2/3, 1/5 plus 1/5, 2/5. But then at some day along the way, a kid has to walk into the room where you write on the board 1/3 plus 1/5. That is simply a larger gap than the average day, and these things occur. So if we know the teachable order and we know that there are outliers, we can tell you what they are. And again, in the resources we provided, we've identified these for you. So for example, that hard, difficult, outlying third grade skill, the hardest skill for kids to learn in grade 3, I can tell you what it is. It's finding the area of a rectangle by multiplying side lengths. Think about it, what it's like to be in third grade. You just learned to multiply. The concept of area has only been tiles for you before. So now we are asking you to apply a new mathematical operation that you have just learned, do so through the use of a formula, and the end result is going to be square units, which are also new to you. That's a tremendous amount of cognitive load. So again, if you follow the links that we provided in the app, you can see a list for all these grades. What are the skills at each grade level that are hard for kids? Often they appear in different domains. Geometry proves to be one of the most challenging domains because it is the application of so many math skills that we teach. And take a look at this. Different grade levels have different numbers of these disproportionately skills that we refer to as trip steps, because they might trip a kid. And then also, too, think about the implications. If we know the hardest skills, we can prioritize our resources. We can see the trip steps by each grade level, and here's something interesting we found. Reading trip steps, math trip steps, put them together, take a look at grade 7. At a point when kids biologically are going through a tremendous amount of differences, we're asking them to do some huge cognitive things. It brings a new insight to why that might be a really hard grade for kids. Really, really thing. The other thing is this. By doing all these learning progressions, we have what we call our universal skills pool. Anytime a learning progression is written, a lot of the standards that you ask for are the same that the other states ask for. But every now and then someone asks for something else. I don't have time to unpack this one, but it's going to be in my slides that you're going to get. Follow this sequence of skills that borrows skills both from the English national curriculum and U.S. references, and what you will find is a very fully, clearly articulated step-by-step way to teach kids to do the addition of fractions that we would only see if we were also open to not only analyzing our own standards, but considering standards broadly across the country and across the entire world. All of that brings us back to Margaret's statement, which I think is true. We've had a lot of standards. If we aspire to take kids' performance to a higher level, we've got to move beyond just our standard focus and move into more of a progression focus, and that will open up so many opportunities for us. With that, I thank you for your time.